Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review the Blade animated series, or the anime series, I should say. So I'm going to review the first six episodes. Hopefully, they'll be in order, but when looking at it, it might be jumped around a little bit. But ultimately, I really enjoyed this anime series of Blade. I think really this Blade series is kind of done the right way, just because ultimately you have it to where Blade isn't 100% fighting vampires. I think really it's a good change of pace to have Blade fighting anything but vampires. It seems like, good God, they had three movies of Blade just fighting vampires. And I think you also have an entire Blade TV series, vampires. Like, good God, can Blade fight anything but vampires? Like, man, um, if you would honestly have Blade going and fighting a werewolf, a mummy, Frankenstein's monster, like anything but reasonably going in here and vampire, like it's fine, but still, it's a little annoying. I was just kind of relieved to watch this show and feel that I'm like, oh, whew, a little relief over there. We do have some very goofy looking monsters that appear upon these episodes. And so reasonably when looking at it, like some stuff is kind of goofy. Like we have like a water tiger that ultimately appears in one episode, which I thought was odd. But man, something different at least. Uh, I really like how they actually have Blade have a real actual name, Eric Brooks in this series. We end up having it to where quite a bit within these first six episodes, we are also getting quite a bit of origin of Blade. Because really, for Blade himself, he is just kind of running through a lot of people. We end up having it to where Blade needs to get a lot of stuff done within these episodes because a lot of the times Blade is just like, as soon as he gets into the fray, he's chopping off heads and killing people and then just moving on because, and that's like a minute of the show. It's just like Blade comes in, kills everybody, leaves. 1 minute of 1 minute of episode to kill a like, and we have to have it to where Blade ultimately fights a difficult being so that way they can stretch time a little bit more, or otherwise Blade is just running through everyone and killing everybody. Um, Ultimately, that's kind of how I feel about this show. Immediately, I would say that besides this anime being refreshing, I honestly felt that uh, you had it to where it doesn't 100% completely remind you of anything that like it doesn't remind you of a Blade movie. Like, yeah, you do have Deacon Frost in this show, which ultimately is just like, oh, okay, well, like it's kind of like the first movie, the first Blade movie, but not really, because when looking at it, there's several additions to this that doesn't coincide with any of the Blade movies. You don't have Whistler so far into this show. Um, I've only watched the first six episodes, and there's no Whistler, there's no mention, there's no reference, there's no whatever. Uh, but what ends up being done in its place is fairly interesting. Uh, we end up seemingly having Blade seemingly right off the bat getting a young protege of sorts. It seems like there is one girl that seems to be tying onto Blade consistently, and there's a reason for that, and I hope I'll talk about that once we get into spoilers. I thought this show was great. Where exactly could you find a convenient way to watch this show? Well, I couldn't exactly find one. I ultimately had this. DVD set on me. Luckily, I was like, yeah, I was so happy with myself for ultimately having that, because I was looking for it and I was like, oh, please tell me that I got this anime. Because ultimately I was looking at where to exactly watch it, and I couldn't even find a convenient place to bootleg it or anything. I couldn't find a convenient thing. Ultimately, I do know that it is on Amazon, but it's not for free. You'd have to actually buy either episode or buy the entire season. So it's not a free, convenient thing. If anything, I would probably go on Amazon or eBay or whatever and see if there's an edition of it that's really, really cheap, because I'm sure it probably is. Probably for like $2 to $3 or something. Because this was done such a while ago, and Blade is kind of on a smaller tier compared to maybe other characters. Um, but I thought that this show was interesting. I like it. Kind of gave me supernatural vibes. If you've seen the CW show Supernatural, that's now done, uh, and reasonably, it kind of gives me, uh, kind of reminds me of like really good supernatural shows. Um, with much less of a budget, because it's an anime thing. It's an anime. I want to keep saying like it's an animated series, but it's an anime. But anyways, I think it's about that time to otherwise go into the double five time count. Ultimately, talk about this show, because I enjoyed it. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil these 6 episodes. So in the very beginning of this, we ultimately have it to where we find out that vampires have yellow eyes. Ultimately, when they are in the fangs and the yellow eyes, that's ultimately when business is picking up, so to speak. So we kind of end up opening this scene with a guy and a girl ultimately trying to make out, and it seems that ultimately the guy is going to take advantage of the girl, but in all actuality, the girl is going to take advantage of the guy because she's a vampire. So she ends up going and trying to attack him, and he ends up going and running off to the police, but the police are actually vampires too. So we end up having it to where Blade makes his way into ultimately finding these vampires, and going and killing most of them, but eventually ending up trying to find or trying to or noticing that ultimately on one of these guys' wrists there's a familiar sign that ultimately he's not familiar with, and so ultimately they are to tell him what that sign is, and he's investigating what it's about. Eventually, we end up having it to where seemingly there is a mother daughter, or a mother daughter. There's a father daughter duo that ultimately we end up having it to where seemingly the father ends up getting bitten by a vampire and ultimately ends up turning. Uh, Mikado ends up going and trying to comfort her father, and we end up having it to where eventually her father ends up turning into a vampire, almost attacking her, and Blade ends up coming in, swooping in, and saving this daughter from her father attacking her. And so Blade ends up killing this father, and Mikado ends up going like, "Oh my God, you killed my father! How could you?" Dude, he's a vampire. He's a freaking vampire. But anyways, so we eventually have it to where ultimately they are to go to this vampire club, and we end up having it to where seemingly instead of having the usual like, oh okay, well, Blade is gonna fight vampires, we end up finding out that Mikado ends up going and seemingly seeking out a seemingly werewolf, a werewolf called Luda, and so we end up having it to where all of a sudden within this club, Blade ends up going and like because at first we end up having it to where Mikado ends up getting the upper hand on this werewolf, but then eventually the werewolves end up, of course, changing into werewolves, and then Mikado, of course, gets outmatched. So Blade comes in and just starts slicing and dicing people, and it's freaking awesome. That is to eventually lead to uh, to ultimately Deacon Frost coming in and ultimately going and uh, making his presence known to Blade. And ultimately, we end up having to eventually, at some points in times, it seems like they are trying to uh, get Blade's blood sample at some points in time within the story. Bizarrely, it seems like they're trying to get blood from Blade to try and snuff him out, and so on and so forth. So we end up having it to where in the very next episode, uh, we end up having it to where seemingly uh, there are there are women missing, and so we end up having a detective, Sakamiza, Sakamiza, the detective of this story. We end up having to where this detective is ultimately going and is ultimately trying to find where these missing women are, and these and so we end up having it to where Blade ends up going and basically showing himself straight up to these detectives, ultimately to have Blade say, "Hey, take me in, take me in jail." And ultimately, this detective is baffled about this. It's like, dude, you seriously want to go to jail? It's a little weird. You pause here for a second. All right. So we end up having it to where this detective is otherwise baffled why Blade wants to be turned in, and we end up having it to where Blade ends up going into the detective's office and to the police station, and we end up finding out that Blade is going into the police station just to get information from one of the police officers. Ultimately, we end up having it where the police officer is to basically divulge that ultimately, like, they have taken control of this police station, and that ultimately it's like, like, yeah, Blade, like, luckily, like, there's no way around this. Like, we've got everything covered, and so we end up leading it to where ultimately Blade is going to eventually get information of where these missing women are, and that is to lead them to uh, seemingly some subway that is, of course, underground subway and so on and so forth. And so we end up having it to where both Blade and the detective, we end up having it to where we find out that there is a guy there that is going to turn into a water tiger character. Uh, it seems that ultimately they had found out that they have been able to do some kind of, I guess, gene slicing, or I'm assuming that this is maybe some monster or creature of some kind that ultimately has some uh, kind of supernatural backstory that I'm not quite aware of. But we end up having it to also that bizarrely this guy with him has a bunch of mutant cats. Mutant cats. Okay, sure. So we end up having it to where eventually Blade, with one slice of his sword, ends up basically decking all of these cats. And so we end up having it to where Blade ultimately tells the detective to free all these women that are hanging a high of this contraption that is holding them to be seemingly bled out. So we end up having to where this detective is to go into freeing these women, and eventually we end up having it to where um, ultimately the bizarrish cats are to come back in, but eventually we end up having it to where ultimately uh, there is a saving grace from that. And so ultimately, we end up having to our Blade is to fight this Water Tiger character. It seems that the Water Tiger character is eventually drowning Blade, and ultimately, White Tiger says, like, well, I'm going to have an advantage because unless you start sprouting gills right now. And so we end up having it to our Blade ultimately goes and fights for air, and then ultimately jumps onto uh, a a giant part of metal that is kind of in between this water. And so Water Tiger is like, dude, do you think just because you're on the surface that you're gonna easily beat me? So we end up having Water Tiger lob out. We eventually have it to where ultimately uh, Blade ends up going, of course, with the kill, and of course he ends up. We end up having it to where eventually that um, the Water Tiger ends up almost about to die, and then he's like, "Well, hey, like if I'm going to die, I'm going to take you all with me." So White Tiger ends up going um, and letting off an explosive that is ultimately going to level this entire environment. So we end up having it to where Mikado ends up going and saving the detective from these cats, bizarrely. And so she ends up running to go and find Blade, and both Blade and Mikado ends up jumping into the water to avoid the explosion, while the detective and all these women are like the detectives like run like your life depends on it, and like the women are just like "Arr!" And so they try to run as quickly as possible to avoid getting killed. And really that's just a bulk of um, really what happens is Blade is still trying to pursue Deacon Frost through other means and whatever, what have you. So we end up having it to where ultimately Blade is to eventually tie himself onto Van Helsing. So, or Noah Van Helsing. So we end up having to our back. We have a backstory where Blade is a seemingly younger kid, and he is to eventually bump into the young Noah Van Helsing, and we end up having it to where eventually Helsing is to come to Blade's aid, and ultimately Helsing is to come up with what is to be Blade's serum for him to be able to take, so that way he doesn't have to need vampire. He doesn't need to suck the blood of humans. So we end up having it to where Blade and Van Helsing's character end up reconnecting with one another and ultimately going onto this ship. We end up having it to where Mikado uh, ultimately is to want to get on the ship as well, but ultimately we have it to where the people are kind of just like, no. Like, Van Helsing is okay with it, ultimately to give them money to make them say yes, but ultimately they are to say like, dude, I don't like women on my ship. It causes problems. But ultimately they pay them off, and ultimately they say, oh no, she's a boy. Everything's fine. So we end up having it to where eventually uh, that uh, Mikado is to go on the ship and almost kill Blade while he sleeps, and that's when Helsing comes in to ultimately tell Mikado about Blade's backstory and when he was a young kid. Um, we ultimately have it to where eventually the ship is attacked by some bizarre looking creatures. I guess they are ultimately called Mandurugos. They're evidently weird flying looking characters that ultimately have like human faces. It looked very odd to me. And it seemed like they kept like attacking the ship over and over again. It seems like they were coming in way too quickly. To ultimately, like, no matter how quickly they tried to fire, these things were just way too fast. And ultimately, that was leading people to ultimately end up dying. Um, we end up having to where Blade ends up going and defeating these things. Um, uh, but ultimately, we also have it to where uh, Blade ends up infecting one of these leader things with a retrovirus. Sure, sure, yeah, retrovirus. Um, and that ends up going and killing the rest of the species, or the rest of the whatever that thing was, which I thought was just weird. Anyways, so we end up having it to where uh, Blade is making his way to the Philippines to ultimately go and uh, uh, talk about him as a child. Ultimately, we end up having it to where um, Blade had ultimately gone and seemingly had a stepmother. And so ultimately, we end up having it to where we see that Blade ultimately has a stepmother, and it seems like there are some officers that are ultimately going and like thinking that Blade is getting into trouble, but eventually Blade's stepmother comes in and ultimately is to say like, "Oh no, he did the right thing. Like, why are you guys giving him flack for? Like, he did the right thing." And so we end up having it where ultimately there seems to be women that are to appear to come out of this building to otherwise also like say like kind of uh, do a tug of war of who actually wants to spend time with Blade tonight, and we end up having to where uh, Blade's stepmother, because we end up finding out that this stepmother ultimately is seemingly the best friend of his biological mother, um, and so bleh, we end up finding out that eventually within this episode that Blade's biological mother ends up coming back. Tara ends up coming back to kill Blade's stepmother because she doesn't know any better, and to burn down the entire home that ultimately Blade had had. And this is a flashback. So ultimately, we end up finding out that Blade had killed his own mother. That was the very first vampire that Blade had ever slayed, was his mother, ultimately leading him into eventually finding the four-fanged vampire that had turned his mother. Because ultimately, that is reasonably Blade's goal, is to find the four-fanged vampire. Is ultimately his goal. But anyways, just repetitiously onto the trail of otherwise Blade and his journey. So uh, we end up having to have now Blade and crew going to Sequilija Island. Sequilija, I don't know how to pronounce it. I know they probably say it in there. But anyways, we end up having it where um, Blade ends up running into, like, I would say, like Native American like characters, like they're very tribal. We end up having it to where ultimately uh, we end up having like one of those like tribal kind of episodes where we end up having this tribe ending up having a monster for Blade to attack. Really, it looked like a flying lizard, is ultimately what they said in the episode. And like, I was just like, man, this is looking really cool. Like, you had this big green looking thing with wings, and I was like, what the heck is this? Um, we end up having it to where eventually uh yeah the whole point of this episode is to get a blood extract from Frost. That is the real true goal of this episode. And really we end up having it to where eventually uh really that's the big pull away from this entire episode. Just a very odd episode, reasonably. Other than that, there wasn't much to really pull away from that. Plus, that episode was kind of really just kind of confusing to me. Out of all the episodes, it was kind of like this one was kind of throwaway. Just because it was kind of, it was rough. Let me pause here for a second. All right. So, here is the last episode. This episode is fairly goofy. Um, I think reasonably we have it to where within this last episode, we end up having it to where there's a lot of bizarrish animal things going on in this episode. We end up having a seemingly a rat man vampire. Does that make sense to anybody? I don't think it does. But we also have it to where there's a vampire bat also talking to Blade, telling exactly where Frost is. We end up having it to where eventually we end up finding out that Frost is ultimately going uh, into some silver mine. Because we end up finding out that um, that Blade ultimately mentions in this series that people are to think that they can use garlic and wooden stakes and stuff like that to be able to take down a vampire, but they be wrong. Or no, wait, he says like garlic and crosses will work on vampires, but they be wrong. If ultimately Blade always found that there be a silver stake would always work on vampires. Ultimately, at some points, we would have characters that ultimately used silver bullets to be able to kill any number of either monsters, beasts, or whatever. And so we end up having it to ultimately uh, Blade is to eventually go and uh, take down this rat man vampire thing, whatever it. It looked to me like a walrus, to be brutally honest. Like this looked like a walrus to me. Um, we end up having it to ultimately. They end up going and ultimately trying to uh, Bah! God, this last tail end of this review was going just swimmingly. Um, Let me pause here for a second. Good God. Okay, we end up in here having bizarrely these characters that ultimately have these very elongated necks. We end up seemingly having a man ultimately to be seemingly hugged by his wife, and his wife is to otherwise wrap her. neck around, or I think it's her arm or her neck around her husband to ultimately start to squeeze the life out of him, to ultimately go and, yeah, I think it's her neck. Ultimately squeezing the life out of him to ultimately eventually go and basically drink his blood. We end up having to, or eventually Blade is to, of course, just rip through these people as he normally would. And so we eventually have it to where we find that there are plenty of these kinds of monsters that ultimately can elongate their neck, and so Blade is going to have to deck all of these people. Um, we eventually have it to where eventually uh, there is ultimately this thing of, like, if there's not a retro virus thing going on, ultimately there is some sacred water that Blade also has to take. Like, man, it just seems like there's so many like artifacts and stuff that Blade ultimately has to collect through this. And so ultimately, the most interesting about this thing here is basically taking down monsters with silver bullets. It seems that ultimately, uh, when Van Helsing was telling his men to go and kill all those things with silver bullets, he was saying like, "Hey guys, like silver bullets are rare, so make every bullet you can count." And so to me, that is to lead to basically having the 6 episodes. So reasonably and or bizarrely, there was a tough time getting through some of these episodes. Reasonably, there were some episodes that were better remembered than others. Um, reasonably, I think probably the best episodes are probably anything that is doing with younger Blade. Just because I think having that backstory of the character was really interesting. I think the very first episode was probably the best episode. I think everything got really weird and really wonky after that. So yeah, I think that's all that I wanted to say about this Blade animated series so far. Eventually, if people are interested in hearing me talk about the second half of this, then ultimately I will go into the second half. So I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.